In the quaint suburban neighborhood of Greenfield, life had always been peaceful and predictable. Trees lined the streets, birds chirped cheerfully in the mornings, and the local cats lounged lazily in the sun. Among these cats was Milo, a tabby known for his easygoing nature and affectionate purrs. Milo was the beloved pet of Mr. Harris, a retired school teacher who enjoyed gardening and spending quiet evenings with his furry companion. One sunny morning, as Mr. Harris sat on his porch sipping tea, he noticed Milo darting toward the large oak tree in the corner of the yard. At first, he assumed the cat had spotted a bird or squirrel, but instead of climbing or crouching to stalk prey, Milo sat at the tree's base and began meowing, a sharp, insistent cry that pierced the serene atmosphere. "Milo, what's gotten into you?" Mr. Harris called out, amused but slightly puzzled. But Milo didn't budge. He paced around the tree, tail flicking, meowing as if trying to communicate something urgent. Mr. Harris walked over, chuckling, and bent down to stroke Milo's back. "All right, buddy, let's see what's so interesting here," he muttered, peering at the tree. Nothing seemed unusual, just the gnarled bark, a few fallen leaves, and a patch of moss at its roots. The next day, the behavior repeated. Milo spent hours by the tree, meowing tirelessly, only leaving to eat or drink before returning to his peculiar vigil. By the third day, Mr. Harris was growing concerned. "What's the matter with you, Milo? Are you feeling all right?" he asked, as if the cat could answer. He tried carrying Milo inside, but the moment he let go, the cat darted back out, resuming his strange cries at the oak tree. Neighbors began to notice. "Harris, what's wrong with your cat? It's been meowing all day," Mrs. Carter from next door commented. Mr. Harris laughed nervously, brushing it off. "Cats are odd creatures. I'm sure he'll get over it." But deep down, unease began to creep into Mr. Harris's thoughts. Milo's behavior wasn't just odd, it was obsessive. The meowing grew louder and more desperate, echoing in the stillness of the evening. That night, as the crickets chirped and the world fell silent, Milo's cries continued, cutting through the dark like a plea. Lying in bed, Mr. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why was Milo so fixated on that tree? By morning, Mr. Harris decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. The tree, so ordinary and unremarkable all these years, now seemed to loom ominously in the yard. There had to be something there, something Milo could sense, but Mr. Harris couldn't see. With a flashlight and a pounding heart, Mr. Harris made up his mind to investigate. The next day, Mr. Harris watched Milo with growing unease. The cat's meows were no longer just insistent. They carried an edge of desperation that sent a chill up his spine. As Milo pawed and clawed at the tree's trunk, his normally calm demeanor seemed replaced by something almost frantic. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Mr. Harris decided to inspect the tree more thoroughly. Armed with a small garden rake, he began combing through the leaves and debris at its base. At first, he found nothing unusual, just twigs, dead leaves, and a few acorns scattered around. But then, as he shifted a patch of moss, he uncovered something that made him pause. Faint scratch marks etched into the bark, as though an animal, or something else, had been clawing at the tree. The discovery unsettled him, but he chalked it up to the local wildlife. Perhaps a raccoon or a stray cat had been marking the area. Still, Milo's persistent cries told a different story. That evening, Mr. Harris sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching Milo under the dim glow of the porch light. The cat hadn't left the tree all day, his meows echoing into the quiet neighborhood. A few neighbors had begun to notice. "Everything all right, Harris?" called Mr. Mitchell from across the street. Your cat's been at it for days now." Mr. Harris forced a chuckle. "Oh, you know how cats are, probably chasing shadows." But shadows couldn't explain the way Milo's ears perked up suddenly, his wide eyes fixating on something unseen. Mr. Harris followed his gaze to the tree, but there was nothing there, just the thick branches swaying gently in the breeze. That night, as Mr. Harris lay in bed, he was startled awake by a noise. It wasn't the usual rustle of leaves or the creak of old wood. It was a low, muffled sound, almost like a whisper, carried through the stillness of the house. Sitting up, he strained to hear more, but the noise faded into the night. He checked on Milo, expecting to find the cat curled up in his usual spot, but Milo was nowhere to be seen. Alarmed, Mr. Harris hurried to the back door and opened it. There was Milo, sitting under the tree in the moonlight, his fur bristling as he let out a low, mournful wail. It was then that Mr. Harris noticed something strange. Around the tree's base, the ground seemed disturbed, as though it had been recently dug up. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Had Milo been digging there, or was something else responsible? The next morning, Mr. Harris decided to share his concerns with a friend. He invited old Mr. Peters, the local historian, over for tea. When Mr. Harris casually mentioned the tree, Peters grew quiet, his brow furrowing. "That tree's been here longer than most of the houses in this neighborhood," Peters said, his voice low. "They say it was planted by the first settlers, but there's an old story, one folks don't talk about much anymore." Mr. Harris leaned in, intrigued and uneasy. "What story?" Peters hesitated before continuing. "It's said that during the town's early days, a child went missing near that tree. Some claimed to hear crying coming from its branches at night. They searched everywhere, but the child was never found. Some say the tree holds secrets no one's meant to uncover." That night, Mr. Harris couldn't stop thinking about the story. As he stood by the window, looking out at the tree bathed in moonlight, Milo's cries sounded almost like a warning. Unable to bear the suspense any longer, Mr. Harris grabbed a flashlight and headed into the yard, his heart pounding in his chest. The air around the tree felt colder, and an unnatural stillness seemed to settle over the yard. As he crouched near the base of the tree, his flashlight illuminated something that made his breath catch. Small, bleached bones scattered among the roots. Trembling, he shone the light higher, following Milo's gaze. The cat was staring at a hollow in the tree's trunk. Mr. Harris hesitated, his hand hovering near the opening. The faint whispering sound returned, sending a shiver down his spine. Swallowing hard, he peered inside, and his blood ran cold. Mr. Harris's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. The whispering sound seemed to swell around him, as though the air itself was alive with an energy he couldn't comprehend. Milo, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, had gone silent. His piercing eyes were fixed on the hollow in the tree, his body stiff with tension. The darkness inside the hollow seemed to swallow the light, but Mr. Harris, driven by a mix of dread and curiosity, stepped closer. He could feel a coldness radiating from the tree, an unnatural chill that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Milo's meows had stopped entirely. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Cautiously, Mr. Harris crouched down, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the shadows. The hollow in the tree was wider than he had imagined, and just as he thought he might see nothing more than decaying bark, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. At the bottom of the hollow, nestled among a tangle of roots and blackened leaves, was a doll. It was old, its face cracked and faded, its clothes tattered and worn, but it was the eyes that made Mr. Harris's stomach churn. They were still intact, glassy and cold, staring straight ahead as if they were watching him. The doll's expression was eerily lifelike, a twisted mockery of innocence. Mr. Harris recoiled, instinctively taking a step back, his flashlight flickering. "What the hell?" he whispered to himself. His hand trembled as he reached out to touch the doll, the urge to remove it almost overpowering. He told himself it was just an old, forgotten toy, maybe a prank from years ago, or a relic of the past, abandoned by a child long ago. But there was something about its stillness, that felt wrong, as though it were more than just an object. Before he could even touch it, a sudden gust of wind swept through the yard, rustling the leaves and sending a cold shiver down his spine. The flashlight flickered one last time before going out entirely, leaving him in pitch-black darkness. His breath quickened. He fumbled for the flashlight, but it was no use. He heard a low creak, then a soft scuffling sound coming from the tree behind him. His pulse quickened, his instincts screaming at him to run. But before he could move, a distant, almost imperceptible whisper floated in the air, like a breath on the wind. "Get it out." The voice was faint, weak, but it was unmistakable. It was a child's voice, hoarse and choked, as if calling out from the depths of the earth itself. The voice seemed to be coming from within the tree. Mr. Harris's blood ran cold. He spun around, but there was nothing, no one, there. The tree stood silent and still, its gnarled branches swaying gently in the wind. Then, Milo's voice broke the silence. This time not a meow, but a shrill, urgent yowl filled with unmistakable terror. Mr. Harris turned back to the hollow, and for a split second, he thought he saw something move inside. A shadow, fleeting and unnatural. His breath caught in his throat as he heard the unmistakable sound of something shifting beneath the ground, as though something were stirring beneath his feet. The earth trembled slightly, and the ground around the tree seemed to pulse. Mr. Harris took a step back, panic rising in his chest, but his foot snagged on something, an object hidden just beneath the surface. With a gasp, he crouched down, his hand brushing against something cold and smooth. It was a small, weathered stone, its surface covered in strange markings. As soon as his fingers made contact, the whispering intensified, swirling around him like a suffocating fog. Suddenly, the tree seemed to come alive. The air around it thickened, and the shadow inside the hollow grew darker, stretching out like a living thing. The whispering turned into guttural, frantic voices, overlapping and rising in pitch. Mr. Harris's eyes locked on the doll once more, and for a split second, he saw its eyes shift. Just a slight movement, but enough to send a wave of nausea rushing through him. He stumbled backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Get away!" the voice growled, now unmistakably angry, twisted with malice. In that moment, Mr. Harris knew he had uncovered something far darker than he had ever imagined. Whatever had been buried with that doll, whatever had been bound to the tree, was not something to be trifled with. The whispers, the shadows, they were all signs of something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting, biding its time. With every ounce of willpower, Mr. Harris grabbed the doll, trembling in his hands, and threw it far from the tree. The moment it left his grasp, the ground beneath him seemed to shake violently. The wind howled, the whispers screeched in a crescendo of fury, and the tree groaned as if in agony. Milo, frantic and wide-eyed, dashed back toward the house, but as Mr. Harris turned to follow, he heard one final blood-curdling whisper, "Too late." The moment the words left the air, everything fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, but the fear remained, gnawing at Mr. Harris's mind. And as he turned to leave, He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him, something that would never let him forget what he had uncovered. The cold wind seemed to hold its breath as Mr. Harris, still trembling from the strange events around the tree, stumbled backward into the yard. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. The doll, now discarded far from the hollow, lay motionless in the grass, but something felt wrong. A sense of finality hung in the air, but beneath it, a deep, gnawing dread was taking root. Milo had darted toward the house, but as Mr. Harris glanced over his shoulder, the cat stopped, his gaze fixed on the discarded doll. For a moment, Milo stood completely still, his tail twitching, his fur bristling in the moonlight. Then, without warning, he turned and ran into the woods behind the house, vanishing into the dark. "Where are you going, Milo?" Mr. Harris called out, his voice unsteady, but the cat didn't respond. He simply disappeared, leaving the yard eerily quiet once again. But as the night deepened, the unease only grew. Mr. Harris hurried back inside the house, locking all the doors behind him. He sat down in the living room, hands trembling as he replayed everything he had witnessed. The whispers, the voices, the doll's eyes shifting in the hollow. It had all felt like a waking nightmare, but the fear in his bones told him this wasn't over. Minutes turned into hours, and Mr. Harris found himself staring at the clock, the tick-tock of the timepiece amplifying the silence. Eventually, exhaustion began to take hold, and he decided to turn in for the night. The house, once comforting and familiar, now felt cold and foreign. The shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed darker, thicker, as if they were alive. He lay down on the couch, his eyes drifting shut, but the sleep he so desperately needed wouldn't come. It was then that he heard it, a faint scratching sound, like claws dragging across the wooden floor. His eyes snapped open, and his breath caught in his throat. "Milo?" he called, but no answer came. The sound continued, scratching, scraping. Slowly, cautiously, Mr. Harris stood up and moved toward the hallway. The scratching grew louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from the floorboards just beyond the door. He took a step forward, then another, until his hand rested on the doorknob. For a split second, he hesitated, feeling a rush of cold air sweep across his face. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the hallway shrouded in darkness. The scratching had stopped. But as he stepped into the hallway, his eyes caught something strange in the corner. His gaze fell upon the wall, where the shadows seemed to twist unnaturally, forming strange shapes. And there, directly in front of him, was Milo, sitting perfectly still, staring intently at something out of sight. Mr. Harris froze. The cat's eyes were wide, pupils dilated, unblinking. The air seemed charged with an unsettling tension, and the temperature had dropped, making Mr. Harris shiver. "Milo?" he whispered again, stepping closer. Suddenly, the cat let out a low, guttural growl. But it wasn't Milo's voice. It was something deeper, darker, like the growl of a creature that wasn't fully of this world. Mr. Harris staggered back, heart pounding in his chest, as Milo's body began to twitch unnaturally. His limbs jerked, his back arched, and a bone-chilling hiss escaped his mouth. The shadow that had been creeping along the floor seemed to rise up, engulfing the cat, and in that moment, Mr. Harris realized with horror that it wasn't just Milo anymore. The shape in front of him was a twisted version of the cat, its fur matted and slick, its eyes no longer those of his pet. They were dark voids, empty, hollow, as though something else had taken control. The creature's form began to distort, stretching unnaturally, its limbs elongating as it crawled toward him, its body moving like liquid, as though it was being drawn from the shadows themselves. "No," Mr. Harris whispered, taking a step back. the creature stopped moving and, for a moment, seemed to watch him, almost as if waiting for something. Then, in an instant, it lunged at him, its mouth gaping wide to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. But before it could reach him, a sharp, disembodied voice echoed in the room, sending a shock of recognition through Mr. Harris. "Leave it. Alone." The voice wasn't from Milo, or whatever had taken his place. It was distant, powerful, like an ancient warning. As the voice filled the room, the creature froze in midair, its limbs quivering, and slowly began to retract. The shadows around it seemed to draw back, as if afraid of the voice's authority. The form twisted back into the shape of Milo, but now the cat's fur was slick and blackened, its eyes still empty, still staring into Mr. Harris's soul. The cat's head cocked at an odd angle, and then it opened its mouth, but instead of meowing, it spoke in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. "You shouldn't have come." Before Mr. Harris could react, the room went cold, the shadows thickening and curling around him. He felt himself being pulled backward, his feet lifting off the ground as if the very air was rejecting him. The cat, or whatever it was, stood motionless, its empty gaze never leaving his face. And just as Mr. Harris's vision blurred and his consciousness faded, the last thing he heard was the same voice, softer now, but filled with an undeniable, chilling promise. "You're part of it now." The room went silent. The shadows retreated, and Mr. Harris was gone. The morning sun crept through the curtains of Mr. Harris's home, casting long, golden rays across the living room. Birds chirped outside, the world seemingly oblivious to the dark events that had unfolded in the night. But when the mailman arrived at the doorstep, he found something strange. The mailbox, usually filled with nothing but the usual bills and advertisements, contained a letter that seemed out of place. It was old, yellowed at the edges, and sealed with a wax emblem, a symbol Mr. Harris had never seen before. At first, he thought it might be for someone else, but upon closer inspection, it had Mr. Harris's name written in an elegant, looping script. Curiosity overcame him, and he opened the letter with trembling hands. It read, "You have seen the truth, Mr. Harris. The tree you have discovered is no ordinary tree. It is a place of transition, a doorway between the living and the dead, the present and the forgotten. You have disturbed what should have remained hidden. But worry not, for you are not alone in your fate. Many have come before you, and many will come after. The creature you encountered was only a reflection, a mirror of what once was. It will return when the time is right, for those bound to the tree are never truly gone. They wait, as they always have, for those foolish enough to unearth their secrets. The shadows are always watching, and the whispers will never stop. You have been marked, Mr. Harris, as have all who have dared to look upon what was meant to remain unseen." The letter ended with a single line beneath the message, "You will understand soon enough." Mr. Harris's hands trembled violently as he read the letter. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. He scanned the empty room, but there was nothing. Nothing but the weight of the letter in his hands and the oppressive silence that had settled over the house. Something inside him shifted. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the past few days, the whispers, the cat, the twisted creature that had once been Milo. It all made sense now, though the truth was far worse than he could have ever imagined. The tree, the hollow, the ancient spirit. It wasn't just a local legend or a forgotten tale. It was real, and it was waiting. He stood motionless for a long time, contemplating the letter, his thoughts churning like a storm. The once quiet and peaceful home now felt like a prison. The shadows in the corners seemed to close in on him, and the house, once a place of comfort, had become something dark, foreign. As the days passed, Mr. Harris found himself unable to shake the strange unease that had settled over him. He avoided the tree, but no matter how far he stayed from it, he couldn't escape the sensation that something was always lurking, just beyond his reach. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the reflection of those hollow eyes staring back at him. Milo's eyes, empty and filled with something ancient. The whispers never ceased. At night, they became louder, echoing through the walls, reaching him in his dreams. "Get away," they whispered. "It's not over." And then, one evening, just as he was beginning to believe he could move on, to forget the horror that had consumed him, a knock sounded at his door. Mr. Harris hesitated. He wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, he walked to the door and opened it, his hand trembling. There, standing on his doorstep, was a figure he hadn't seen in days. It was Milo, but this was not the cat he had known. The creature standing in front of him had the same sleek fur, the same lithe form, but its eyes, those empty, void-like eyes, stared at him with a chilling recognition. Its body was unnaturally still, yet there was something terribly wrong about the way it stood. Milo's head tilted to one side, a soft, unnatural purr vibrating from its throat. "Did you think it was over, Mr. Harris?" the creature purred, its voice not Milo's, but something far darker. The door slammed shut as if on its own accord, trapping Mr. Harris inside. The last thing he heard before the house fell silent was the soft scratching of claws on wood, just like that night. And in that silence, Mr. Harris realized the truth that the letter had promised. He hadn't been marked just by the tree, by the creature, or by the curse. He had been marked by the shadows themselves. The whispers would never stop, and soon they would find him. As for the house, it remained empty for weeks. The curtains never moved, and the door never opened. The neighborhood assumed Mr. Harris had simply left town, but the tree in the backyard stood tall, its gnarled branches twisting against the sky, waiting for the next unwitting soul to come too close. And as for Milo, he never returned to the tree. He had become something else, something that would never leave the house again. It was no longer just a place. It was a door, and the shadows were always watching.